The insult was delivered in public, loud enough to force a choice. A karate master spoke as if the room belonged to him, as if Bruce Lee's method was a trick, a modern shortcut that couldn't survive honest pressure. Bruce didn't answer with a speech. He didn't answer with anger. 30 seconds later, the crowd wasn't reacting to a fight. They were reacting to something quieter, control taking the place of violence so completely that the insult had nowhere left to stand. Witnesses said the method was hard to describe afterward, but the silence in the room was not. The room was not built for ceremony, yet it carried a kind of social gravity. It might have been a dojo, a rented hall, or a training space used by several groups depending on the day. Plain walls, worn flooring, mats arranged with practical care. A few banners or calligraphy pieces might have been present, but nothing about the space suggested a theater. It was a place where people trained, argued about training, and occasionally tested what they believed. On that day, there were more observers than usual. Not a large audience, but enough to make the air feel attentive. People stood along the edges with the posture of visitors, hands quiet, voices lowered, eyes tracking the center of the floor. Some were students, some were guests. A few were simply curious, drawn by names they had heard repeated with increasing confidence. Witnesses later described the mood as respectful but unsettled, not because anything had happened yet, but because the room contained two different understandings of authority. One was formal, belts, titles, lineage, the kind of respect that arrives before the person does. The other was practical, the respect earned when someone moves with economy and calm, when nothing is wasted and nothing is performed. Bruce Lee did not enter like a guest of honor. In most accounts, he was already present, either training, speaking quietly with students, or observing. His demeanor was consistent with the stories people told later, focused, controlled, and uninterested in spectacle. He didn't scan the room for approval. He didn't announce his ideas. He moved the way a working man moves, small corrections, short repetitions, an attention to distance that felt less like style and more like habit. The karate master arrived with a different kind of presence. The respect around him was immediate in the way formal hierarchies create immediate respect. People recognized him, or recognized the category he represented. He carried himself as someone used to being listened to. He spoke confidently to those near him, and his confidence spread outward through the room like an expectation. At first, nothing seemed confrontational. Introductions, nods, small exchanges. But witnesses noticed a subtle shift. The master's attention kept returning to Bruce, not with curiosity but with evaluation. He watched Bruce the way someone watches a challenge they did not expect to face. In spaces like that, tension doesn't need an argument to exist. It can exist simply because two forms of authority are present in the same room. The crowd senses it. They adjust their positions without being told. They become quieter without agreeing to be quiet. That was the environment before the insult: ordinary training space, heightened attendance, and a room that had not chosen conflict but could feel it approaching. The insult did not arrive as a shout. It arrived as something worse in formal rooms, dismissal wrapped in confidence. The karate master spoke to others first, about principles, about tradition, about what real training looks like. The comments carried an implied comparison. People listening began to understand that Bruce was being positioned as an example of what the master considered untrustworthy. Witnesses later disagreed on the exact words, but the shape of them stayed consistent. The master suggested that modern methods were diluted. That efficiency, as Bruce described it, was a way of avoiding discipline, that what looked fast often meant what was not proven. He spoke as if the room should naturally agree. The crowd reacted cautiously. Some nodded politely out of habit. Others kept still, not wanting to choose a side. In a room full of martial artists, public disagreement can become a kind of challenge itself. Then the master directed it more clearly toward Bruce. It might have been a comment about movie fighting, or about lack of formal rank, or about disrespecting tradition. Whatever the content, the intent was consistent: to reduce Bruce in front of witnesses. This mattered because insults in public are rarely about the target alone, they are about the crowd. The master was asserting that he controlled the room's definition of legitimacy. If the crowd accepted his framing, the contest would be decided without any physical test at all. Bruce did not respond immediately. That pause, witnesses said, was the first sign that the master had misjudged him. Bruce didn't stiffen, he didn't look offended. He didn't search for allies in the room. He listened the way a calm person listens when he is deciding whether something needs an answer. Someone tried to soften it, suggesting a friendly exchange, a demonstration, a chance to compare without humiliation. The master, confident in his social advantage, treated those suggestions as unnecessary. He continued speaking as if the matter were settled. Bruce finally spoke, but not to defend himself with words. He asked for clarity, quietly, without heat. The question wasn't a challenge in tone. It was a request that forced the master to state what he actually wanted. And that forced the room to recognize the situation for what it was, a public test of authority. The master accepted the public nature of it. He did not back away, because backing away would weaken the posture he had already taken. He indicated that if Bruce's approach had merit, it should show itself without excuses, here, in front of witnesses, under conditions the room would respect. Bruce agreed to a short demonstration. Witnesses emphasized the word short, not because Bruce promised an easy win, but because he set a boundary that implied control. 30 seconds, give or take, not a prolonged fight, not a spectacle. A demonstration long enough to answer the insult, and short enough to prevent the room from becoming a circus. The master expected, perhaps, a clash that would confirm his framing, tradition versus modernity, rank versus reputation. What the room was about to see did not confirm either story. It confirmed something quieter, that control can speak louder than violence, even when violence is available. Once a public demonstration was agreed upon, the room reorganized without instruction. People stepped back from the center, forming a semicircle with the careful spacing of those who had seen situations escalate before. The energy was tense, but not excited. It felt like the room was trying to remain respectful while preparing for discomfort. The karate master carried his authority into the cleared space. His posture was formal, practiced, and familiar. He stood as someone who expected the crowd to read his presence as proof. Titles are often carried that way, through posture and certainty, through the confidence that others will interpret tradition as legitimacy. Bruce stepped into the space with none of that theater. No bow for an audience, no show of readiness beyond what was necessary. Witnesses later remembered his shoulders, low, relaxed, uninviting to panic. They remembered his hands, close, economical. They remembered his eyes, not fixed on the master's face so much as attentive to line and distance. The master spoke again, briefly, one last remark meant to frame the moment. The crowd's silence made his words sound louder than intended. It also made them sound more vulnerable. In quiet rooms, overconfidence echoes. A few people suggested rules, light contact, controlled pace, no injuries. The master appeared to accept restraint only because refusing would make him seem reckless. Yet he still moved as if he expected to dominate within those limits. Bruce's calm created psychological pressure without aggression. That was part of what witnesses struggled to articulate later. Bruce did not intimidate by threat. He intimidated by refusing to be impressed. The master stepped forward first, or at least he made the first committed motion. That detail varies, but the intention is consistent. He wanted to assert that his authority could be physical, not only verbal. In his world, legitimacy often ends in technique. Bruce did not meet force with force. He did not prove himself by clashing hard. Instead, he seemed to remove the master's ability to control the exchange. The tension rose sharply at that moment because the crowd expected impact, two styles colliding, pride colliding, but the impact did not arrive in a dramatic form. The master's forward pressure met an angle that wasn't there a moment before. His line of attack, whether a grip, a step-in, a strike, was redirected into a space that offered no target. The master adjusted quickly, as masters do, but every adjustment created a new opening, and those openings appeared faster than the crowd could narrate. This is why the crowd's tension increased even as the exchange remained controlled, because it became clear that the master was being led into mistakes he did not realize he was making. In public, that is devastating, not physically but socially. It erodes the certainty that gave the insult its power. Bruce did not hurry. That calm pacing made the master's effort look more frantic by contrast. The room sensed the shift before it could explain it. The master was no longer controlling the narrative. And in a room full of witnesses, losing control of the narrative is the first step toward losing the insult itself. The 30 seconds were not filled with violence, they were filled with removal. That is how witnesses described it later, not a fight, but a kind of subtraction. The master's options diminished, not because Bruce attacked him recklessly, but because Bruce refused to occupy the places the master needed him to occupy. A grip did not fail in the dramatic sense. It failed because leverage disappeared. A step-in did not miss in the cinematic sense. It missed because the line changed. The master's technique was still technique, still recognizable, still disciplined, but the exchange made it look heavy, while Bruce's responses looked like economy. At least once the master attempted to impose structure through closeness, closing distance, compressing space, forcing contact. That is often how formal styles try to regain control, reduce variables by bringing bodies together. In that moment, the room might have expected Bruce to brace or resist. Instead, Bruce changed angle, a small pivot, a shoulder drop, a hip turn that made the master's forward pressure become his own obstacle. The master remained upright, but his posture broke for a fraction of a second. In fighting terms, it wasn't defeat. In human terms, it was uncertainty appearing on a face that had arrived too confident to show it. The crowd reacted not with cheering, but with a kind of collective stillness. The stillness meant they had seen something they could not dismiss as cooperation. It looked too clean, too minimal, too final without being violent. The master attempted again to reassert control. Another step, another technique, and again, Bruce's response was small, so small it almost looked like nothing. But the result was visible. The master was repeatedly prevented from establishing a stable position. Witnesses later said the master seemed to lose the room's support during these seconds. Not because the crowd turned against him emotionally, but because the crowd stopped believing his insult. The insult depended on the idea that Bruce's method was superficial. Now the room was watching a demonstration that looked simple, but acted like it had depth. The 30 seconds ended without a finishing move. That was the point. Bruce did not need a dramatic ending to prove control. He simply stopped at the moment the answer was complete. The master found himself standing, breathing slightly heavier, with no clear evidence of victory and no clean path to claim dominance. The crowd's silence was the verdict. It wasn't loud approval of Bruce, it was quiet withdrawal of belief from the insult. Bruce lowered his hands. He stepped back slightly. The gesture was not surrender, it was closure. And in that closure, the room understood the difference between violence and control. Violence would have extended the moment. Control ended it. When the demonstration was over, it was over. The master's collapse was not physical. It happened inside his certainty. He had delivered a public insult, expecting a public hierarchy to protect him. If the crowd accepted his authority, Bruce would either refuse to engage, allowing the insult to stand, or engage emotionally, allowing the master to frame the result. What the master did not anticipate was a response that neither refused nor escalated. Witnesses said the master tried to speak afterward briefly, not to apologize, not to praise, to explain. Explanation is the refuge of pride when the body has lost the argument, but the room did not need explanation. The room had watched. Bruce did not add to the master's embarrassment. That restraint became part of the lesson. If Bruce had mocked him, the master could have blamed disrespect. If Bruce had hurt him badly, the master could have blamed brutality. Instead, Bruce's calm left the master with nowhere to place blame except his own assumptions. The crowd's reaction mattered. They did not rush forward with congratulations. They did not turn the moment into hero worship. They simply stayed quiet, and that quietness was a kind of discipline. It prevented the room from becoming a theater. It also signaled that the master's social advantage had evaporated. In many retellings, the master's eyes are remembered clearly. Witnesses said his gaze changed from certainty to calculation, as if he were trying to locate what he had missed. That change is humiliating in public, because it reveals that knowledge is incomplete. Bruce behaved as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. He returned to training posture. He adjusted a student's stance. He spoke quietly about distance and positioning without referencing the insult directly. He did not deliver a moral. He allowed the event to be its own moral. That is where Bruce's philosophy appeared, not in speeches but in behavior, efficiency, restraint, adaptability, humility, each one demonstrated by what he chose not to do. The master, now deprived of the crowd's backing, began to withdraw, not dramatically, no storming out, just a subtle reduction in presence, hands lowering, feet stepping back. A posture that no longer demanded attention. The insult had been answered, and the answer was not aggression, it was control. Witnesses often concluded this part of the story the same way, with the sense that the master had learned something without being taught in words. The lesson was implied in the experience, and because it was implied, it was harder to reject. In a training room, the deepest embarrassment is not losing. It is realizing you were wrong about what you were seeing. That realization lingered in the silence long after the master stopped speaking. The story endured because it remained modest. People who weren't there wanted it to sound like a fight. They wanted a clear strike, a dramatic takedown, an ending that could be replayed in a sentence. But the witnesses kept returning to the same details: a public insult, a short demonstration, and a room that watched belief change hands quietly. Over time, the master's name faded from the retellings. That helped the incident survive as a lesson rather than as gossip. It was not remembered as a master humiliated, but as a moment when control replaced violence in public. Students who heard the story later often expected it to contain a moral speech. It didn't. That absence made it more believable, and it also shaped the culture of the room. People began to understand that if you wanted to test something, you should do it cleanly, briefly, without turning it into entertainment. In some training circles, the story became a reference point for how to handle public provocation. Not by refusing every challenge and allowing rumors to grow, and not by escalating to violence, but by setting conditions and ending the moment as soon as the truth is clear. Witnesses described the effect as long-lasting. They said the room felt different afterward, less tolerant of empty talk, more attentive to results that don't shout. They said the master's insult became a cautionary example. Authority that depends on humiliation is not stable authority. Years later, when people asked those witnesses what exactly Bruce did, they often struggled. Not because they wanted to be mysterious, but because the method was a chain of small decisions: angle, line, balance, timing, small enough to be invisible to casual eyes, powerful enough to dismantle a public claim. That is how the story became legend-based without becoming fantasy. It did not claim miracles, it claimed discipline under pressure. The ending of the story was always quiet. Bruce returned to training. The crowd dispersed. The room resumed its ordinary rhythm. The master's insult did not explode into a feud or a brawl. It simply lost its power, and perhaps that is why the story stayed alive, because it offered a different picture of strength, not loud strength, not violent strength. Strength that can answer an insult without becoming one.